Everyone. Thank you for coming on this Friday morning. I'm Corinne Lakesfeld, the interim provost for the University of Denver. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land where the University of Denver now sits. It is the ancestral homeland of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, of whose loss we both recognize and mourn. Like the history of so many institutions in the American West, ours is complicated, complex, and sometimes painful. In recognition of this fact, and to underscore our commitment to inclusion and equity, we commit to listen and affirm the stories of all those in our community. And we offered continued respect and support to the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, as well as all other Native American communities throughout Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West. So I'd like to welcome everybody today to the Provost Conference that is so aptly named this year, the Summit on Shared Governance. This is a partnership between myself, the Board of Trustees, and Faculty Senate. And it is nice to see the turnout that we have. I see many familiar faces. They include staff, they include faculty, even a few students sprinkled throughout. This is what today is about. Shared governance doesn't actually work if too few people show at the table, or if the table is too small. This is really our first step. We're gathering some of the smartest people around topics of interest today. And our conversations won't mean that we always agree, but we'll be sharing honestly our perspectives, creating the foundation for which we can launch further conversations. It is through shared governance that we have an opportunity to think about why things matter, what things matter, and how to elevate and change our practices at the university. This is more important probably now than it's ever been in our history. Because of the challenges in higher education and the change that we've seen on campus, it's very important that we can bind together as a community, work together, and move forward together. Today we've designed these sessions so that each of our stakeholder groups have a voice. There are sessions that are designed by students, for students, designed by staff, for staff, designed by faculty, for faculty, but intersprinkled throughout the day, as in this session, there are times where we bring the groups together for discussion, community building, and a little bit of debate. We've brought two incredible thought leaders to our campus today to help guide us in some of our thoughts and our reflections. It's impressive that they have given their time to our campus and help us work through these things. So we'll start off today with one of our keynote speakers. Really, we'll be reflecting on the history and the principles of where shared governance is. We'll come to understand it and how to move it forward that's true to who we are as our culture. It won't and can't be what somebody else has. It must be ours as we push forward. And through this, we must recognize that our faculty carry out our daily mission in their day-to-day activities, in their classrooms, in their research labs. They engage the students through experiential lecture, lab, and research experiences. We recognize that the faculty have expertise that spans not only the learning environment, but their disciplinary skills that actually touch all the operations of the university. Our students, we wouldn't necessarily be here if we didn't have them. They're central to our mission, therefore. But we often make decisions guided by what we think is best for them. Sometimes we make assumptions, and it's important to hold those assumptions out and allow the students to express that maybe we've misinterpreted them or we've misrepresented them. Without their active inclusion as we move through these difficult times, it's not clear to me that we'll come to the right solutions. The staff. I think it's important to remember our staff almost outnumber faculty by 2 to 1. They actually support students, administration, and faculty. They support all the engines and stakeholders. And in that way, they have a unique vision or insight into what's happening on campus. Their ideas and their solutions sometimes are really innovative because they cross all the facets of the university. So shared governance is not simple. It is something we have to work at. It has to become our daily practice. As we talked last night with the Board of Trustees and Faculty Senate, some administrators, we began to realize one of the most important things is to communicate. And to communicate often, and not communicate through report out. Communicate through dialogue, discussion, get to know each other, maybe even think about becoming friends of each other. So before we kick off the keynote speech, though, I want to take a moment and thank all those that participated in organizing this. So to Darren and Kate, thank you very much for all you've done in organizing, thinking, and developing. There was an organizing committee around this. The faculty and the staff that helped, they include the Staff Advisory Council, students from graduate student government, students from undergraduate student government, faculty from the American Association of University Professors, faculty from the Morgridge College of Education, and of course, individuals from the Office of Teaching and Learning. I have a special thanks, though, to Christy Burgett. I don't see her. Where is she? We need to clap for Christy. She's really the behind-the-scenes person that coordinates everything. And if you don't know it, she's behind every one of those emails. She's behind each and everything that we do and set up. And so thank you very much. Thanks to events, thanks to Sodexo. Today we will be taken care of so we don't have to worry about anything. Things will arrive and leave on time. It is very nice for all of those people to help us. So with that, I would like to introduce Cecilia Orphan to present our
Good morning. My name is Laura Sponsler, and I'm a clinical assistant professor of higher education at the Morgridge College of Education. It is my pleasure to be here today as part of the Provost Summit on Shared Governance and to be able to co-introduce my advisor and mentor, Dr. Matt Hartley. Both Dr. Orphan and I were Matt's doctoral advisees at the University of Pennsylvania in the higher education program. Today gives us the rare opportunity to publicly acknowledge and thank our mentor. Matt, thank you for your continued support and good counsel, and for being my role model as a professor, person, and academic leader. You are the reason that I'm standing here today. One of Matt's many gifts to me is that as a student, he immediately treated me as a colleague. And I watched him treat everyone on campus as a colleague, faculty, staff, and students. And so for you, my DU colleagues, I'm so excited to welcome Matt here today so that we can all learn from his expertise on shared governance.
So as Laura and Corrine said, my name is Cecilia Orphan. I'm an assistant professor of higher education in the Morgridge College of Education. And I'd first like to start off by echoing Laura's appreciation and thanks to Matt. Matt has been a friend, colleague, and mentor for going on 10 years now. And he is also the reason why I'm here at DU, happily placed in a faculty role where I get to teach and research things I care deeply about. I'll never forget what he said during a particularly difficult part of my dissertation. The artistry is in the doing. Trust yourself. So yes, it's wonderful to have him here, although Laura and I have been joking that it feels a little bit like he's checking up on us. In all seriousness, though, Matt's mentorship has been incredibly important to Laura and me and has shaped how we have both approached our roles as faculty members and in particular, how we engage in shared governance. So for those of you in the audience who have never met Matt and didn't have the enormous pleasure of being advised by him as doctoral students, let me provide a bit of introduction to him. Matt received his education doctorate and master's in administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard University and his bachelor's in art history from Colby College. Matt is a professor in the higher education division at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is also associate dean of the Graduate School of Education and founding executive director of the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, or AHEAD. AHEAD is dedicated to promoting the public purposes of higher education and fostering open, equitable, and democratic societies. Matt also serves on the Board of Trustees for Widener University. These roles, I think, perfectly reflect what I know to be Matt's professional and scholarly commitments and expertise. He spans 3 important governance roles in higher education as a university trustee, an associate dean, and a full professor. He is also deeply committed to advancing our understanding of higher education's role and purpose in a democratic society. While I was a PhD student, Matt became involved in research and consulting with Kazakhstan as they designed a higher education system that was situated in goals of nation building and economic development as a country that had just gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1990. As a result, I came to know far more about this country than I ever thought I would or planned to. Too often, when US researchers and leaders are called on to consult in international contexts about policy or education, they bring with them a Western view that seeks to transfer what we do in this country into other countries. One of the major lessons I learned from working with Matt on this research was the importance of not being prescriptive or importing Western governance structures into contexts in which, frankly, they may not make sense. Matt is currently engaged in research exploring how disparate nations, including Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Singapore, and India, have worked to establish world-class universities. In this work, he and his collaborator, Alan Ruby, have avoided transposing US ideas about what a world-class university is into these countries. Instead, Matt and Alan have sought understanding of how different countries define this for themselves. At the heart of Matt's research and administrative leadership is a love for ideas, collaboration, and democracy. Indeed, he has served as a thought partner, collaborating with administrators and faculty all across the world, which is why I am so excited that he is here today to serve as a thought partner for us as we consider how to build on our strengths with regard to shared governance and how to borrow lessons he has learned through his research and time in administration. And once again, it is likely true that the artistry is in the doing when it comes to shared governance. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Matt Hartley to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks. Wow. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really quite moved, and I think that it's important to say that you both are probably the prime examples of why I love what I do so much. I do think it is important to make this slight correction, which is that you are here because of your gifts. And so it's a pleasure to be here as colleagues having these conversations with you. It is a great pleasure to be with you all here today on this beautiful day. And I have the opportunity to work with campuses in a number of different contexts, thinking about these issues around shared governance. And so I thought that I would begin my comments with just a few thoughts about these conversations as you sort of move forward into the day. My first thought is that discussions about shared governance on campuses often emerge because of issues that have occurred on a campus, or a sense of unease, or a sense that things have become somehow unbalanced for some reason. And so people decide now is a good time for us to sort of revisit these things. And I think that that is important. It's important to think about what's happened and to reflect on it. But I also think it's important to consistently remind yourselves that it's at least as important to think about the future, which is that where do you want to go as a community, and how do you want to be working productively together? So as you continue these conversations, keep at least one eye forward on the path ahead. The second point I'd make is reflected in this New Yorker cartoon, which I love, which says, "I know we didn't accomplish anything, but that's what meetings are for." I think that often we gather together and have discussions, but the point here is to come up with actions, the artistry in the doing. So there are people who are going to be at every session taking notes. This is also my understanding is that this event that's happening today is part of a whole series of events that will be happening and a whole series of discussions. So as you participate in this, think about the things that this collective needs to take on, and also think about what is it that you can do in your particular areas to advance shared governance as we think about these ideas. And the final point, of course, comes from Dilbert, which is, I'm moving to a shared leadership model. Each of you will take one piece of the leadership role. What's my piece? Let's see, I have you done for something called blame. I think it's important to remember that the goal in pursuing shared governance is come to a point where there's shared trust, and there's a shared sense that everyone is at least acting in what they believe is in the best interest of the institution itself. That's what you're working towards. So with that preamble in mind, this whole idea about how colleges and universities are governed is, of course, something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And the Association for Governing Boards recently did a survey of leaders across the country. And there was not just strong support, there was near universal support for the ideal of shared governance. When asked if the American Association for University Professors' a concept of shared governance reflected their own policies and practice, 96% of the respondents said that they were either similar, very similar, or the same on their campuses. Of course, an ideal is one thing, and reality is another. Winston Churchill was once asked what he thought of democracy, and he said, "It's the worst form of government there is, except for all others." And governing collaboratively, sharing power is something that is challenging. We certainly see that today in Washington, and we see it on our own campuses. And so what I'd like to do in my remarks is three things. First, I'd like to briefly describe this ideal of shared governance that's laid out in the AAUP 1966 statement, which is sort of the seminal document that lays out what we think of when we talk about shared governance in the US. And secondly, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves why shared governance is important. Why does this matter? What are its benefits? Is it still relevant? And finally, I'd like to talk just a bit about the state of shared governance nationally and some challenges that institutions face across the country, and then turn to a conversation getting your perspectives on the issues that are presenting themselves here. So the AAUP was founded in 1915 by Arthur Lovejoy, who was a philosopher from Johns Hopkins University, and the great American philosopher John Dewey. And the event that led to its founding was the firing of Edward Ellsworth from Stanford University. Ellsworth was doing really important research that focused on the exploitation of Chinese laborers on the Southern Pacific Railroad. It just so happened that Leland Stanford had run the Southern Pacific Railroad. And so his wife, who was on the board of trustees, went on a crusade to get Ellsworth fired. And that really galvanized a group of faculty to come together to think about how they could protect academic freedom and shared governance. And I think I should also mention, in the interest of full disclosure, that one of the very earliest cases taken up by the AAUP occurred on my very own campus, Penn, which involved an economist, Scott Nearing, who was doing research. He was an economics professor, and he was doing research on the very prevalent practice at that time of child labor. And a number of the Board of Trustees were unhappy with that research and opposed his reappointment. And so since those early days, the AAUP has been about the business of shining a light on instances where academic freedom and shared governance are threatened. The AAUP 1966 statement was designed in partnership with the American Council on Education, which is the national association that serves college and university presidents, and also the Association of Governing Boards that serves boards of trustees. And the document was not intended to be a set of rigid rules for institutions, but rather a set of broad concepts that they hope that institutions would adapt to suit their own purposes. What the statement essentially lays out is the following. On every campus, there are, in the view of the statement, 3 key constituencies: the Board of Trustees, the senior administration, and the faculty, and each group has an important role to play. The governing board is responsible for the long-term well-being of the institution. Taking the long view, is what we're doing now going to put us in a better financial position or strategic position 10 years from now? As the statement puts it, the board plays a central role in relating the likely needs of the future to predictable resources. And in order to fulfill these duties, the board should be aided by the development of long-range planning by the administration and the faculty. The president serves as the agent of the board on campus, and he or she is responsible for working with others on campus to ensure the day-to-day work of the institution is accomplished. And the president also typically plays a key role in coordinating strategic planning efforts. As the statement puts it, the president shares responsibility for the definition and attainment of goals, for administrative action, and for operating the communication system that links the components of the academic community. And finally, the faculty has primary responsibility for the scholarly activities and all activities related to the educational process. And this includes things like what subject matter should be taught, who should teach, what methods of instructions are called for, degree requirements, those kinds of things. A key thread that you can see in this entire statement, and you can see it reflected in these quotes itself, is the necessity of collaboration. And the statement, what the statement calls an inescapable interdependence between these constituencies. Today, our institutions operate in an environment that our colleagues a couple of generations ago would find almost incomprehensible, the pace of change. There's been a dramatic divestment in higher education in the public realm. Demographic shifts are changing our country. Technology is introducing new instructional possibilities and raising really important questions about very familiar concepts like seat time or credit hours. Institutions have to be nimble. They're competing with one another. And they have to be responsive, and they have to adapt. And so given all these challenges and the pace of change, the question is this: is shared governance an old-fashioned idea from a simpler time? There are individuals that are arguing that what we need today is more central control. So William Bowen and Eugene Tobin, in their 2015 book, Locus of Authority, say, final decision-making authority, in our view, needs to be located unambiguously in the hands of the senior administrators with campus, university, and sector-wide perspectives, who can be and should be held accountable for their decisions. And so the basic claim that they're making is that central control is better, it's more efficient, and that the buck should stop with the president. And the question is, are they right? I think this view of the president and the senior administration as a strong central authority may work reasonably well at extremely well-resourced institutions like Princeton or Hamilton, which is where Bowen and Tobin were presidents. But the vast majority of our institutions are facing complex challenges with finite resources. And addressing those challenges requires tapping the expertise of all of the constituent groups in order to move forward. Central control is problematic for a few reasons. First of all, we know from research on governance in higher education that the surest road to a failed presidency is unilateral action, making decisions without consulting others. Robert Birnbaum and colleagues did a major study from the University of Maryland examining governance histories and practices of more than 30 institutions. And his team found that presidents who acted on their own, who failed to consult with others, whose communication with other constituent groups was poor, were the ones whose presidencies failed. By contrast, presidents with successful tenures were sensitive to the social and political dynamics on their campuses. They were committed on an ongoing basis to engage with others. And as a faculty member at one institution put it, they not only make good decisions, but they follow good processes. So politically, centralization doesn't have a great track record. We also know from social science research that good decision-making is adversely affected by like-mindedness. Groupthink is the term that Irving Janis coined to describe this phenomenon. Like-minded groups tend to frame problems in similar ways. They consider fewer alternatives. They tend to be overconfident, and they're less willing to admit their mistakes. And when groups with disparate interests and disparate viewpoints come together to engage in discussion and decision-making, better decisions are more likely to result. And the same is true with shared governance. Shared governance brings together the disparate views of the board, responsible for the long-term view, the senior administration, overseeing the administrative aspects of the university, and playing a key role in strategy development, and the faculty, whose expertise has to be tapped if there's going to be any meaningful progress in the educational efforts of the institution. So each of these views is distinct and valuable. In my research and in my work, I interact a fair amount with board members. And I've heard a number of times board members say that they wish that colleges were run in a more business-like way. And I agree. I think that colleges and universities should run like businesses, especially businesses like Google and Apple. These are organizations of highly skilled professionals working in semi-autonomous units, pushing initiatives forward. And they work through the power of ideas, not by complying with top-down dictates. Steve Jobs put it this way, he said, innovation is what distinguishes between a leader and a follower at Apple. So the idea is to create an environment where leadership becomes an organizational quality, one that supports people so they can collectively work to improve the institution and advance its purposes. Having a say in the decision-making process, I think it's important to say, also means having shared responsibility. So while Bowen and Tobin argue that the buck should stop with the president, in a process where there is shared governance, if a major initiative or a major plan goes south, it's everyone's responsibility. To me, shared governance means all constituents acting in good faith and assuming joint responsibility for key decisions that affect the institution. So let me paint for you a picture of shared governance today. These data come from a terrific study that was done by Bill Tierney and James Miner at the University of Southern California. And they did a survey of 1,700 academic leaders and faculty leaders at colleges and universities across the country. And they found, among other things, it was a terrific study, a lot of terrific findings, but they found that 75% of the people surveyed felt that levels of trust and communication are at least sufficient to engage in shared governance. So that's good news. There's sort of a baseline on which to work. They also found three major models of shared governance at work. 47% of the institutions followed what they called a fully collaborative or collegial model of decision, where decisions are made through consensus between the administration and the faculty. 27% follow a consultative decision-making process where, on large strategic issues, the faculty opinion is sought, but the ultimate decision rests with the administration and the board. And then 26% of the institutions have what they call the distributed model, where each group is responsible for particular kinds of decisions. So you let us make decisions around the academic things, and we'll let you make decisions around the finance things. It's that kind of thing. The temptation of going with the final model is that it does tend to reduce conflict if you sort of divide up who's responsible for what. But as a faculty at one institution I was at put it, it's a devil's bargain because it prevents collaboration. People don't come together to puzzle through things. And they are not drawing on the expertise of everyone in order to solve their problems. So given this picture and given some of the governance challenges, what is it that individual institutions can do to promote shared governance? Some of my early research looked at some of the factors that tend to promote or impede perceptions of legitimacy about shared governance processes on campus. And it may be that you can't see what's on the slide, but I'll read you some of the key takeaways. Having meaningful opportunities for participation, being transparent and open about the decision-making process, encouraging debate and supporting and even protecting naysayers in order to give them voice, and accepting the outcome of agreed upon decision-making processes. All of these things lead to greater perceptions of legitimacy about the decision-making process, and they lead to greater trust. By contrast, limiting access to decision-making, controlling information, controlling who sits at the table, manipulating the process, isolating or even threatening naysayers, which does happen on some campuses, leads to a toxic environment and gridlock. The Association of Governing Boards recently released a set of guidelines for strengthening shared governance, and I think that they're a very nice complement to that set of positive factors that I just described. First of all, campuses need to engage key constituents in discussions about shared governance, and that's what we're doing right here. That's the purpose of this day. And research shows that on many campuses, there is not a clear understanding about the basic tenets of shared governance. A related point is that it's important to be clear about the responsibilities and roles of each constituent group. So who should be consulted on what kinds of issues? Often there's lots of lack of clarity on campuses about that. It's important to maintain transparency and to have frequent communication. When decisions are made at the institutional level, it's important not only to communicate what the decision was, but why it was made. And often we don't do that. And finally, it's important to periodically take stock and assess the state of shared governance. How are we doing? These findings very much map on to some of the key findings from the study at USC, and Adriana Kizar, who will be with you a little bit later, has been involved in some of this work too. And you can see it echoes some of the same things that the AGB was talking about. Having clarity around purposes and roles, communication. Assessing governance means asking important questions like, what does each constituency expect from shared governance? What is it that people want? Often we make assumptions about what it is that people are looking for in terms of involvement in shared governance. Does each constituent group believe the others are being transparent in sharing information? Do key constituents feel they have enough information to make good decisions? The constituents believe their own structures, as they currently exist, foster shared governance. And that means not only the kinds of committees that might exist, but who serves on them, and why do those people serve on them? And is there shared agreement about the strategic priorities of the institution? I think that last point is incredibly important. Because the key question that institutions have to ask if they're going to be successful are, what work are we trying to do in the world? What is our mission? And where are we going? What Jim Collins and Jerry Porras called your envisioned future. DU, according to the website, aspires to be a great private university dedicated to the public good. Its mission is to promote learning by engaging with students and advancing scholarly inquiry, cultivating critical and creative thought, and generating knowledge. Our active partnerships with local and global communities contribute to a sustainable common good. What I hear when I read this is a deep commitment to making a difference to your students and the communities that you serve, expanding knowledge through teaching and learning and also through research. It's a commitment to making a difference in the world around you. But what does it mean to all of you? And what are the best ways to realize that ideal? Being clear about what you value and being clear about what an institution is trying to achieve is very powerful. It aligns people's efforts and ensures that people are all pulling in the same direction. And it gives people a sense of meaning about their work, helps them see that their efforts are contributing to a larger purpose. Engaging in discussion and debate about these issues, what's important to us? Where do we see the institution headed? Is critically important for the long-term success of any institution. And often these discussions are not easy. As I said earlier, we live in very, very challenging times. Our institutions are competing in an educational environment where resources are scarce, faculty roles are shifting. And along with these challenges, our society is facing very difficult issues, and they are looking to us to try and address them. How do we heal a deeply divided nation? How do we address persistent poverty? How do we create a sustainable environment so our grandchildren have a place to live? Facing those challenges requires us to tap the best ideas our institutions have to offer. And it requires us to ask ourselves, how are we preparing graduates for lives of purpose in the 21st century? What vision is there for what this institution might be 10 or 20 years from now? Grappling with these questions is what a very beloved and long-standing provost at Swarthmore College referred to as the endless good argument, an ongoing debate among good colleagues about the most important issues facing our institutions and our world. And that, at the end of the day, is what shared governance is all about. Thanks. So I do have a couple of guiding questions that I'd like us to deal with, but before I do that, I wanted to sort of pause and sort of see if any people had thoughts or reactions to some of what's just been laid out. Yeah.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. What is the role of students in all of this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that institutions, I think there's, first of all, what's very interesting to me about the 1966 conception of shared governance is it focuses just on those three constituents. And I think that that may have been actually quite appropriate back in 1966. Institutions were there were many fewer staff members, much less administrative support. Faculty played an important role in providing a lot of those administrative aspects. So I think it was a different world back then. So I think part of what institutions now need to begin to puzzle through is who are the most important constituents on their campus. Students are incredibly important. Staff are incredibly important. What are the roles for them? And so I think that's, I don't think there's any sort of easy silver bullet answer to that, but I appreciate you raising the question because I think that we do need to have a more expansive view on who are those important constituents that we're thinking about as we think about how we draw on all those people to get the best ideas and move the institution forward. Other thoughts? Yeah.
And the old Greeks and Romans attached considerable value to what was old.
Yeah.
And had all kinds of doubt about what was new. We've turned that over, and innovation now is accepted as good, and what is old is looked at with suspicion.
Yeah.
Innovation for innovation's sake, unless it is critically directed, unless someone can try to extrapolate the consequence of this innovation, it might be disastrous.
Yep.
Is, I think, to be questioned almost as much as what the public good is, something with which we're wrestling now as we look to our next curriculum.
That's such a great point. I think that's the reason why having these larger questions around purpose and values is so important, because those are the things that are enduring. One of the worst strategies that institutions can pursue to try and succeed in this very challenging environment is to try to be all things to all people. And that's what chasing innovation for innovation's sake often does. Oh, well, we need to have one of these, or someone else is doing this, we need to do that. It's disastrous. What institutions need to be asking themselves is, what unique purpose do we have in this world? And so I think that's right. I think it's keep going back to what are those things that do not change too? What are those core values, those things that sort of speak to us about what this work is, and not rushing into things. I think that's a very important point. And I think that's also a reason why shared governance is so important, because it requires people to have those kinds of dialogues around these things. Thank you for that. Other thoughts? Seeing none for the moment, let me, oh, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
I think it's a great point. I think it's a great point to make sure that we consider the value of the lessons from the past and the practices in the past as well as the future. But I think as we move forward, the key point is that the future is not inevitable. It's based on decisions that we make. And those decisions should be consciously made, recognizing that consequences of sticking with what we have are as real as consequences of adopting change. So we should not view a conservative path as one that does not embrace innovation, and we should not view a risky path as one that does, but instead look at the best mix maybe between both at the same time.
I think that's a really helpful clarification. I think it's using those common understandings of where we're trying to head, those shared values, as something of a filter, so that then you can decide what are the things that we want to move towards, what brings us closer to what we think, where we think we want to be, and what things are a distraction from that purpose. That's a great point. Other questions? Amanda?
Matt, it's great to see you. Thanks
Yeah,
for
you
being
too.
here. I'm Amanda Moore-McBride. I'm Dean of the School of Social Work here and have had the great privilege of writing with Matt over the better part of the last 2 decades on civic engagement. I would appreciate your musing about the status of society in terms of civic engagement and how civil discourse, or our ability to even have deliberative discussion across difference, finds its way into higher ed, and the role that that plays in our challenges around governance.
I think it's incredibly important, and one of the things that you see happening across the country are institutions grappling with this. So I've served as one of the core reviewers for the Carnegie Engagement Classification for the past, I guess, decade or so. And as you look at people's applications for that designation, which requires institutions to really show a fairly deep commitment to this work on a number of different levels, one of the things that you see emerging is a movement away from just community-based work, like let's just be in the community and put students in the community, to work that is either oriented more towards change, like how can we sort of be partners with the community in reciprocal partnerships to enact change, and also a lot more work happening on campuses around things like deliberative dialogue. In other words, how do we heal this rift that we are experiencing now? Where it's not just that people have differences of opinions around policies, people literally cannot understand the planet other people are coming from. That's a fairly deep divide. And so institutions, I think, have an important role in helping people think through those. And you're seeing evidence of lots of people do that. So I think that, again, this is one of the things that society is calling on us to do more and more of. How do we sort of like help prepare people who, when they go out into the world, whether it's the workplace, whether it's in their communities, they're hopefully being a part of the solution rather than sort of like exacerbating the problem. Yes?
Thank you for using the word change, because it seems that in so much of the rhetoric now, even in the phrase making a commitment or a commitment to making a difference, I hear that a lot, but it's sort of like, to what? It's
Yes.
making it, you know, and I think it's implied in certain circles, of course, that making a difference in a positive way and for positive social change, but we don't actually come out and say that.
Yeah.
You know, that it's to kind of reclaim a progressive,
Right.
socially progressive philosophy in higher ed. It's almost going back to Dewey,
Yeah.
and a commitment to making people's lives better and the well-being of communities through positive social change in a kind of reformist way, if you will, or not. But I just thank you for saying the word change, because it is about what is the status quo, questioning the status quo, and how do we want to very deliberately devote our work to positive social change.
Yeah.
So thanks for using that word.
I appreciate it. I do think that's right, that I think that there is a way in which we need to reclaim a sense of agency. What is it that we're actively trying to do in this world? And I think that's important not only for us to do in our individual work and individual roles, but also for us to think collectively, what is it that we're doing? You know, what are we pushing for? I think that's why this idea of an envisioned future is helpful. Like, where do we see ourselves? And then what will it take in order to get us to that point, to produce that change, to bring in that change that we'd like to see in the world? But I think that the environment that's required for those conversations to happen is an environment in which there is this healthy shared governance, in which people are able to have conversations with one another across different backgrounds and let those powers of the ideas emerge and move us forward, rather than be sort of bound by the status quo, which we can so often be, given the demands on our time.
And I had a question, just with
Sure.
your ability to have gone into different countries and sort of reimagine a system there, higher education systems. Curious just some of the most interesting insights you have gotten from getting sort of out of the North American Western context.
Wow, that's a great question and a huge one. So I guess I would say one of the insights is the one that Cecilia mentioned too, which is that there are ways in which we there are ways in which we operate where we take certain things as articles of faith. This is the way things ought to be, and that when you go into other contexts, you see things that challenge your thinking. I think institutions have to make sense of the sorts of practices that fit who they are and their culture. So to use Kazakhstan as an example, if you were to take sort of the shared governance model that we and that, according to the AGB, the vast majority of colleges and universities endorse, that model of shared power is something that's very hard to grasp in a culture where elderly people of authority are deeply valued. So if you have someone who's like the Akeem, which is the equivalent of a governor of a state, sitting on the board of a national university, and he says this is what should happen, that's what's going to happen, because there's this cultural deference to that person. So you begin to learn that people need to adapt these things to suit their own circumstances. It's also true in the US. There are institutions that are fairly hierarchical, and people like it that way because it's safer. Someone will take care of me. If I do my own thing, I get to do what I want. That's good enough for me. So I think you learn that there's a lot of variation, much more variation than you would say, than you would think. I think the other thing that pushes your thinking just in international work generally, this has maybe less to do with governance per se than in our practices, is that I'm often really inspired by what I see, the depth of commitment to their communities, to the students they serve. So I was sharing this with Ryan last night, but I was visiting a university in India, the University of Pune, and they were talking about how every year they will have students who will show up, first-year students who will show up having traveled 2 days with nothing but the clothes on their back. And they take them in, and they find them places to live, and they provide them the textbooks, and they get them through their education. I don't know of a single institution in this country that would do that. So it radically pushes our views on what's possible by looking at what some institutions are trying to do. So those are some of the things that sort of stick out for me. This is a little bit of a digression, I apologize for that based on our conversation, but since the question was asked. Yeah.
I do agree that collective decision-making, often I sit on a board for a small town, and collectively we make better decisions than any of us as an individual would. But sometimes it doesn't work. Like, we wanted to declare, participate in a declaration that radon was bad for you, that state had already signed on, and we couldn't even do that. And sometimes I think arguments just need to be won, right? Like slavery, bad.
Right.
We had a civil war over it.
Yep.
And with climate change, right? I'm almost done trying to convince deniers that climate change is going on. And the faculty have petitioned the Board of Trustees at this institution. The students have petitioned the Board of Trustees at this institution to divest from fossil fuels.
Yep.
And we have a mission statement that says we're dedicated to the public good. And it just, that violates any, I don't know how I'm ever going to trust this institution, because there are other things like that. But that's a perfect example of, really, we're trying to build trust when that's our mission statement and we can't divest. And
Yeah.
University of California has already done this. I mean,
Yep.
huge institutions have already done this. So curious how you would comment on
Sure.
how you build trust when you have situations like divestment at this
Sure.
institution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I could be wrong about this, but my sense is California ain't Colorado. So I think part of what happens is that, this sort of goes back to that quote that I shared at the very beginning about Winston Churchill saying democracy is the worst form of government there is except for all others, which is that it's not a perfect system and you are never going to arrive at full consensus over everything. You're absolutely right. The best you can hope for is in situations where there is disagreement, that you can come to the point where at least you can understand what the other person's viewpoint is, even if you disagree with it. That's not particularly satisfying, but actually I've seen on campuses places where if you can get to that point, even if there's sharp disagreement, there's still a measure of trust. Why? Because at least I can understand where you're coming from, even though I think that's a lousy decision. But if there's not enough conversation to even get to that point, then it leads to what you're talking about, which is like, really, what is going on here? Like, I don't even have any idea what you're thinking that you wouldn't just sort of say that this is what we would do, right? So I think that's sort of where sort of finding the ways in which these groups can productively work together. What are the mechanisms that they use for those kinds of productive conversations to happen? That's what you hopefully want to move towards, because otherwise it leads to exactly what you're saying. The situation in which people are just mystified, with why people are coming, where they're coming from, and that does lead to mistrust. You're exactly right. So let me, if I could, ask you all to take just a few minutes in your tables and reflect on the following questions. You're welcome to sort of, as a group, think about any or all of these. I'll give you like 5-10 minutes or so to sort of talk, and then I'd like to sort of hear back. The other thing, too, that I want to point out is that there are people that are taking notes from this session because, again, this is something that is a part of a long process. So some of the issues that we raise here will be carried forward, not only in other sessions today, but also moving forward. But these are questions that I think might be helpful. So the first question I have is, to what degree does the ideal that I've just described correspond to shared governance as you've experienced it at DU? And we've already talked a little bit about that, but that's one question. Second question is, what are some of the most important areas that you think DU needs to focus on in order to strengthen shared governance? So as you think about how that ideal is laid out there, where are the shortcomings, areas that need to be focused on? And the third question, which I think can be very interesting, is this. If you had a time machine and could travel back and speak with the people who put in place DU's current system of shared governance, what advice would you have for them? So take about 5 minutes in groups and talk through any and all of those that speak to you. All righty. What did folks talk about? And what would you like to share with colleagues? Yes, Corinne? Here.
Okay, so at this table, what we really were talking about was the 4 or 5 ideals of shared governance that we were thinking about. We talked about what DU's been doing and the changes that we've made. And then we talked about what could we do better in the future? Like, where are like essential places that we can make change? And one place we spend a lot of time on is this idea of communicating that people that serve on university-wide committees actually have a lot of power because of the knowledge that they hold. And that somehow, as they come back to their units in advancement as staff members or in divisions like NISM, there must be a better mechanism or requirement for those people to share their knowledge back to their units and thereby give up a little bit of power by giving everybody else that greater knowledge. And that's a big culture shift. That's really what we were talking about.
That's interesting. One of the things that came up as a theme last night in the meeting with the board was the challenge, and it's many campuses, the challenges of communicating. And I think one of the major, there are sort of 2 possibilities for the challenge around communication. One is how the message is being sent and the means by which it's sent. And the other is on the receptor side, which is that I don't know what your emails look like, but I know what mine look like, right? Where we are constantly inundated with things. And so how is it that you sort of communicate important decisions to people? And I think this idea of figuring out what are those communications channels and how do you get them to sort of like the local level? You know, to be candid, please don't quote me on this, but I am far less likely to open and read an email from the president of my university than I am my department chair. Right? So if it's an important decision and something comes from the dean or the department chair, that feels more local to me than a broad pronouncement about something that's happened that's like, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, anyway. So I think that's a great point, Corinne. Thank you.
So our table was talking about a real disconnect with shared governance when it comes to the Board of Trustees.
Yeah.
They're kind of a black hole that we don't know who they are. We never see them, never talk to them. And I guess our main interaction is when a decision comes down on high. It doesn't seem that as a stakeholder, they're part of this shared government.
Right, right. And if there's not meaningful communication between you, like direct communication, not filtered through other people, you're going to have less confidence that what's being told and conveyed has the richness of what you want to convey. You know, it's the game of telephone. So I do think a lot of campuses are trying to figure that out. What are the sort of mechanisms where board members can meet with faculty around productive issues and get their viewpoints so that it informs their thinking? I think that Cecilia mentioned I serve on the board of Widener University, which is about half the size of DU. It's a private university outside of Philadelphia. But regularly there are issues that we take up where faculty will actually come and present and talk with the board on things. So when we were making decisions around considerable investments to do a doctorate in a health area that required not only a lot of money for the labs and things like that, but also restructuring of faculty roles. It was the faculty that explained to us how that would work. And so I think finding ways for faculty, the other thing that what you don't want is for the faculty to be the dog and ponies who come to the board to sort of like, this is the, I mean, some of that should happen because you do want them to know the good work that's going on because you want them out there raising money for you. And that's part of what sort of gives them fodder for that. But also you need to be involved in more substantive ways. So I think that's a really helpful example. Other things people talked about?
So our group talked about the tension between having time to be part of decisions and not wanting to be bothered. And that balance between I really would love to be a part of this decision and want to be at the table, and there are too many service requirements. And when you're in a resource-stressed environment, that becomes even more poignant.
Yeah, and I think that's where making sure that you have systems in which you feel there are representatives that are bringing your interests forward is so important. Because for most of us, the way we sort of live our lives, that, you know, the teaching that we do, the advising, the research, it's like, that's enough. Or if your staff members, the important portfolio of activities you have, that's enough. But if you have a sense that there are people that you can go to if there are concerns, or if you're sort of, but someone else is sort of tending to those on a sort of moment-to-moment basis, I think that can be really helpful. But I do think that's a challenge on a lot of campuses for sure. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, at our table, we were, first of all, wondering whether you presented an ideal or not. As a matter of fact, you gave us
probably right.
You gave us a choice.
Yeah.
I mean, there were 3 different models that universities have adopted, and one of the discussions was maybe it's not a choice. Maybe our choice should be that we build a system that embraces all 3 of those models depending on the specific decision that's being made, and maybe have some shared understanding across all of the constituencies about when it's appropriate for each of those models to be invoked. And maybe there's a 4th model that a foundation of trust and communication, which would be the ideals maybe that you identified, the foundation of trust and communication can be built. There may be even a 4th model, which is an autocratic model at times, where simply the leaders of the university make some decision and there's such trust among the constituents that they say, yes, this was an important thing to do, but done so infrequently that it's not overused and that trust is abused. Yeah. And so perhaps that's an opportunity for consultation today, is to talk about not which of the models we would adopt, but when and how we can build trust and communication that allows us to be comfortable with a variety of models.
That's really helpful, and I think that's right on the mark. I think the ideal is really the one that was set up in the 1966 statement. That is, that there are these constituents and they will work together and sort of share power. That's sort of the idea. But you're right, in terms of practice, what the USC study found, it's much more complicated than that, for sure. And I think that you're right that it is important. One of the reasons why it's important to make sure that people understand the different roles of those constituents, and also, quite frankly, even to understand your existing policies. It's important because on many campuses there are kerfuffles that occur over things like the selection of the president, when it's pretty clear the board selects the president. And on many places there is 0 consultation. And so, but again, those are points of conversation. So there might be certain ways in which we should be consulted, but we understand that someone else is going to make the final decision. But other things that have to do with our strategic direction, maybe it ought to be more collaborative, because it's going to really take all of us to work together to move this forward. I think that's really helpful as you think about the different kinds of decision points you're facing.
Okay, I think ours builds a little bit on that, and I'm going to interpret what our table said, so it may or may not relate to what they said. I think starting with number 3, the time machine wouldn't work because that implies that someone designed our current system. I think our current system has evolved over time.
Intelligent design?
In a practice. right. It's been more of a sense of practice that sort of we've kind of moved into this without necessarily thinking through, as perhaps we're doing now, what that should look like at different points in time. What that results in Or where we are then is a number of parallel processes.
Yeah.
Within units, there's decision-making processes. Within layers of administration, there's decision-making processes. Sometimes among all the faculty, there's decision-making processes. The board has a decision-making process. The administration does. And because of these parallel processes, people can put a lot of work and thought and care into try to make decisions and do things. But because they're not necessarily in sync with the other processes, there can be a great deal of frustration and lack of trust about what's going on. So decisions are made that aren't matching other decisions being made or other processes. So we end up with a system that has evolved to move against trust and to not generate trust. And I think that then we don't end up not having the communication.
That's a really, really great point, really helpful. As you all move forward on your journey, one exercise you might think about taking up that's fairly simple but actually fairly powerful is to get a group of people like this in a room and have them identify decisions that are made or have been made on campus and who was involved in making them and who should have been involved in making them. The reason why that's powerful is because often people, I just did this with an institution not long ago, and there was sort of heterogeneous people, administrators, faculty, staff in tables, and there were entire tables that were like, we know that this is a decision was made, we have no idea like actually how it was made, or we actually don't have any idea who had the final say. We just don't know. But I think those things surface, those parallel processes you're talking about, Danny, that it's like we're sort of operating in these random ways, and so they aren't in sync. And so thinking through, well, what are the decisions that are made? You know, it also helps you sort of surface those things that you take for granted. Well, according to these decisions, these and these people should be made. Well, really, is that the best people now? I mean, that might have been what was good 20 years ago, but maybe you ought to revisit that. So something to consider as you guys continue your journey. Other thoughts that people had?
Yes. At this point, I will not just report back on what we said because it coincides with what others have said. So I'll just, I don't know, say my own little thing.
Nice.
So something that I shared with the table was how when I went as a student to a university in Guatemala, which is where I am from, there was a very clear, and it was a public university, and I'm not saying that that's the model that the U needs to follow, but as a student there, my experience was such that if I was concerned about something, if I felt that something needed to change, there was a student representative that I could tell and who had the job and the space for bringing that. And eventually, that could go all the way up in the university to a collegial body that had 1/3 of representatives from the administration, 1/3 from faculty, and 1/3 from students, all of whom were democratically elected. And those spaces were spaces of dialogue, debate. Because So I guess my reflection is that sometimes, and I have expressed this in other moments, sometimes if I am really concerned about something, or if a student is really concerned about something that would like to, I don't know, do to improve things at the university, there's no clear path of how to do that, where to do that, to whom do I present this?
Right.
And so in my opinion, there should be some way for making sure that there are staff, student, and faculty representatives at different levels from the local all the way to the university-wide, where those discussions, those debates happen, and not only where communication goes up and down, because there have to be spaces where dialogue happens, right?
I so appreciate that, and often we do think about the communication system as being sort of how do we sort of get ideas sort of filtered down to people. It's equally important to figure out the system for filtering the ideas up, because you're not going to benefit from all the ideas of the people that are part of your institution unless you can find ways to do that. And so making them more transparent, what are the mechanisms that people can use? If people have issues, who do they go to? What are the mechanisms to sort of bring issues or concerns or even new ideas forward? I think that's really, really important. We have time for about one more.
I want to echo what Alejandro said.
Yeah.
And your introducers that said you treat your staff and your students as colleagues. You know, you're essentially all people engaged in the same thing. At my undergraduate institution, students had, I think one of the problems with the DU right now is the students feel that it's a very transactional degree. They come here, they buy the degree and they're gone, and that hurts alumni relations.
Sure.
Students were given control over physical assets for periods of time. They could take over the hockey rink, they could take over certain buildings, and we had a concert committee that had brilliant concerts, right? And so the students felt part of their institution. They had control over some of the physical facilities, not necessarily the complex policies, degree requirements, et cetera, but I think that gave them buy-in, that they were participating in their institution, and I think that better alumni relations happened as a result of that. Students are an important part of that shared governance structure of an institution.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I think that's exactly right. And finding ways for students to really have a stake in the game, you know, including real resources that they can allocate. I think that's really important. So we're at the end of our time, but I wanted to just leave you with a quick thought, if I could. As I think either Cecilia or Laura mentioned, as an undergrad, I was an art history major. And so, one of the artists who I have come to really appreciate is a guy named Craig Dumrauer, who's a conceptual artist. He also is a writer for the Atlantic Monthly. Has had all sorts of exhibits various places, including the Museum for Contemporary Art here in Denver. But he's probably best known for these equations of words that he puts up that are very provocative and interesting. And I want to share one of those with you as sort of my final thoughts, which is modern art equals, I could do that, plus, yeah, but you didn't. I think shared governance is like that too. I think there are ways in which already from the conversation, just this very, very beginning conversation, you can see people have very clear ideas that would result in demonstrable change and improvement. This is not, at the end of the day, despite the complexities, despite the political dimensions of this, yes, it can be challenging, but it's not rocket science. It requires a lot of work, a lot of dialogue, but I just want to sort of reflect the fact that I think that already in the conversations that's occurred, there are a lot of terrific ideas that have come forward, and the task moving forward, not only for today, but as this moves forward, is to capture those ideas and figure which are the ones that we can enact, which are the ones that we can move forward. So look forward to being part of these conversations for the rest of the day with you.
Well, just, join me in thanking Matt for an incredibly informative and engaging talk that I think is going to do so much to help us build a shared understanding and vocabulary for shared governance. So thank you, Matt. We now have a half an hour between now and our morning breakout sessions. I would encourage you to hang out, talk to your colleagues, continue these conversations that were started at your tables. And then at 11 o'clock, we have 4 breakout sessions. Would it be helpful if I told you what they were and where they were? Okay, excellent. We'll have a breakout session called Advancing an Equity Agenda with Coalition Building, moderated by Judy Kiama and Cecilia Orphan. It's in the forum room, which is on the first floor. It's C1020. You go down the elevator, walk out of the just walk straight out. It's going to be on your right-hand side. It's a big window with big room with lots of windows. We have a staff breakout called Fight or Flight, the value of engaging staff and giving them a voice. That's in C1108, and it will be moderated by Garrett Glass. We have a faculty breakout session called Achieving Shared Governance in C2110, moderated by Aaron Schneider, and a student breakout session called Student Interactions with Governing Boards in C2115, and that it will be moderated by Matt Walter. So please take the next half hour, enjoy time with your colleagues, and hope to see you back here at lunch at noon. Thank you.